In the mountains of western North Carolina stands a house that should not exist. Biltmore Estate contains 250 rooms spread across 4 acres of floor space. It has 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, and an indoor pool. When George Vanderbilt completed construction in 1895, the project had consumed 6 years and cost approximately $6 million. Adjusted for inflation, that exceeds $200 million in today's currency. No American has built anything remotely comparable since. The reason has nothing to do with changing architectural tastes or declining ambition. The world that made Biltmore possible was destroyed deliberately through taxation, regulation, and public fury at extreme wealth. What replaced it reveals something darker about modern inequality. The billionaires did not disappear. They simply learned to hide. In 1888, George Washington Vanderbilt II was 26 years old and controlled a fortune that exceeded the annual budget of most American states. He was the youngest grandson of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, who had died 11 years earlier as the richest man in America. The Commodore had built his empire on steamships and railroads, transforming transportation across the continent. When he died in 1877, his estate was valued at approximately $105 million, more than the entire United States Treasury held in gold reserves at the time. The fortune passed primarily to the Commodore's son, William Henry Vanderbilt, who proved even more capable than his father. William doubled the inheritance within 8 years through railroad expansion and ruthless management. When William died in 1885, he left approximately $200 million divided among his 8 children. George received roughly $10 million outright, plus substantial trust income. At 23 years old, he became wealthier than he could spend in several lifetimes. George was different from his relatives. His older brothers built mansions in Manhattan and Newport, competing to construct the most elaborate showpieces on Fifth Avenue and along the Rhode Island coast. They hosted costume balls that cost fortunes and filled newspapers with scandalized accounts of excess. George preferred books to parties. He spoke 8 languages, collected art, and traveled Europe studying architecture and landscape design. He was shy, intellectual, and uncomfortable with the performative wealth displays that defined Gilded Age society. In 1888, George visited Asheville, North Carolina for his health. Doctors recommended the mountain air for his chronic respiratory problems. The town sat in a valley surrounded by the Blue Ridge Mountains, accessible by railroad but still relatively isolated from eastern cities. The climate was temperate. The scenery was spectacular. The land was cheap. George saw something beyond a health retreat. The forests reminded him of European estates he had visited. The mountains provided natural boundaries and privacy. The region was economically depressed, which meant labor and materials would cost far less than in the industrialized North. He could build something here that would be impossible elsewhere. He began purchasing land immediately. By 1889, he had acquired approximately 125,000 acres surrounding Asheville, an area larger than many eastern cities. The price was remarkably low. Much of the land had been logged or farmed to exhaustion. Local owners, struggling economically after the Civil War's devastation of the South, sold eagerly to the wealthy Northerner offering cash. George hired the best designers money could procure. Richard Morris Hunt was America's preeminent architect, trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Hunt had designed the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty and numerous Fifth Avenue mansions for the Vanderbilt family. He understood grand scale and classical proportion. George asked him to design a house worthy of the mountain setting. Frederick Law Olmsted received the landscape commission. Olmsted had designed Central Park in Manhattan and parks in dozens of American cities. He had pioneered the profession of landscape architecture in the United States. At 67 years old, he was at the peak of his capabilities and reputation. George wanted Olmsted to transform 125,000 acres of cutover forest and exhausted farmland into a planned landscape that would rival anything in Europe. The initial conception was modest by comparison to what eventually emerged. George spoke of building a country house where he could retreat from society and pursue his intellectual interests. Hunt sketched a comfortable residence. Olmsted proposed gardens and a working farm. The project expanded rapidly. Hunt's sketches grew more elaborate with each revision. George wanted a library to house his growing book collection, which already numbered in the thousands. He wanted guest rooms for extended visits from family and friends. He wanted entertainment spaces appropriate for occasional social obligations. He wanted technological systems that would make the house comfortable and modern. Hunt looked to the Loire Valley in France for inspiration. The château of the French Renaissance combined grandeur with livability, formality with elegance. He designed a 4-story limestone structure with a steeply pitched roof, massive chimneys, and elaborate stone carving. The style was French Renaissance revival, transplanted to the American South. Olmsted conceived something unprecedented in America. Rather than simply landscaping around a house, he would create a managed landscape encompassing the entire property. Formal gardens would surround the residence. Beyond them, planned forests would demonstrate scientific forestry practices. A model farm would prove that modern agricultural methods could restore the region's depleted soil. The estate would be self-sufficient, producing its own food, lumber, and income. Construction began in 1889. A private railroad spur was built to the construction site to transport materials. Limestone was quarried in Indiana and shipped south. Craftsmen were recruited from across America and Europe. At peak activity, more than 1,000 workers labored on the house and grounds simultaneously. The scale defied anything previously attempted by a private individual in America. The foundations required excavating into bedrock. The steel structural frame was engineered to support stone walls 4 feet thick. The roof covered more than an acre. Every system was designed for permanence, as though the house would stand for centuries. George visited the site regularly during construction, making decisions on details that ranged from stone selection to furniture placement. He worked directly with Hunt and Olmsted, refining plans as the structure rose. The project consumed his attention completely. He had no interest in business or politics. Building Biltmore became his life's work. The house was designed around specific functions. The ground floor contained public spaces, a banquet hall that could seat 64 guests, a library designed to hold 10,000 volumes, a billiard room, and multiple sitting rooms. The second floor held family bedrooms and guest suites. The third floor contained additional guest rooms and storage. The fourth floor housed servants' quarters. Below ground, a basement level contained kitchens, laundries, mechanical systems, and a swimming pool. Technology was integrated throughout. Electric lights powered by the estate's own generator illuminated every room. Central heating systems carried steam through miles of pipes. An intercom system allowed communication between floors. Elevators transported people and supplies. The house contained innovations that most American buildings would not adopt for decades. Olmsted's landscape work proceeded simultaneously. He planted hundreds of thousands of trees and shrubs, many imported from Europe and Asia. He created a 3-mile approach road that wound through planned forests, designed to build anticipation before revealing the house. Formal gardens descended from terraces behind the residence, featuring fountains, statuary, and seasonal plantings. The farm encompassed thousands of acres, with dairy operations, vegetable gardens, and livestock. By 1895, construction was sufficiently complete for occupancy. George opened the house on Christmas Eve with a family celebration. The project had consumed 6 years and approximately $6 million, equivalent to more than $200 million in current dollars. The result was unlike anything else in America. Biltmore contained 250 rooms, spread across approximately 175,000 square feet of finished floor space. It had 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, and 65 fireplaces. The banquet hall rose 75 feet to a barrel-vaulted ceiling. The library's shelves stretched 2 stories high. The indoor swimming pool measured 70 feet long, lined with imported tile. The house was simultaneously a residence, a museum, and a statement about what private wealth could accomplish. George was 33 years old when he moved in. He had created the largest private residence in American history. He had employed thousands of workers for years. He had proven that a wealthy man could build something that rivaled European palaces. He had also built something that was already obsolete. The world that made Biltmore possible was about to change completely. On Christmas Eve 1895, George Vanderbilt opened Biltmore House to his family for the first time. Snow covered the Blue Ridge Mountains. The approach road wound through 3 miles of planned forest before revealing the château rising from its terraced hillside. Inside, electric lights illuminated rooms filled with art and furniture collected across Europe. A fire burned in the banquet hall beneath a 75-foot barrel-vaulted ceiling. The house was finally ready. The numbers defined what George had built. Biltmore contained 250 rooms across 4 stories, plus a full basement. There were 35 bedrooms for family and guests. 43 bathrooms featured modern plumbing with hot and cold running water. 65 fireplaces provided supplemental heating throughout the structure. The finished floor space measured approximately 175,000 square feet, roughly 4 acres under one roof. Richard Morris Hunt had designed the exterior in the style of the Loire Valley Château. Indiana limestone formed walls 4 feet thick at the foundation. The steeply pitched roof, covered in slate, rose to elaborate chimneys and decorative spires. Stone carving covered the facade with Renaissance details that required craftsmen trained in traditional European techniques. The effect from a distance suggested a French palace transported to the American mountains. The interior spaces reflected George's intention to create not just a residence, but a private museum. The entrance hall rose 3 stories, lit by a massive wrought iron chandelier. The banquet hall could seat 64 guests at a single table beneath a ceiling painted with medieval designs. The library occupied 2 stories, with shelves designed to hold 10,000 volumes. George's collection already numbered more than 20,000 books in 8 languages. The winter garden brought the outdoors inside. A glass-roofed conservatory featured a central fountain surrounded by tropical plants that would bloom year-round. Palm trees reached toward skylights 3 stories above. The space demonstrated that technology could overcome climate. Philanthropy, providing a permanent summer within the mountain winter. Recreation facilities reflected Gilded Age excess adapted to private use. The bowling alley in the basement featured equipment imported from European manufacturers. An indoor swimming pool measured 70 feet long, lined with tile, brought from manufacturers who specialized in Turkish baths. A gymnasium contained equipment for modern physical culture. These were luxuries that only the wealthiest hotels offered to the public. George installed them for his personal use. The technological systems integrated throughout Biltmore represented the cutting edge of 1890s engineering. Electric lighting powered by the estate's own generating plant eliminated the need for gas or oil lamps. Central heating distributed steam through miles of copper pipes to radiators in every major room. An electric intercom system connected rooms across the vast house, allowing servants to receive instructions without walking the corridors. 2 elevators carried passengers and freight between floors. Refrigeration systems cooled rooms designated for food storage. These were innovations that most American buildings would not adopt for another generation. The staff required to operate Biltmore numbered more than 80 people living on the estate. 30 servants worked inside the house as cooks, maids, butlers, and footmen. Additional workers maintained the mechanical systems, tended the grounds, and operated the farm. The 4th floor of the house was devoted entirely to servants' quarters, with small bedrooms, separate dining facilities, and a network of backstairs and service passages that allowed staff to move through the building without disturbing the family. Frederick Law Olmsted's landscape work extended across the entire 125,000-acre property. Immediately surrounding the house, formal gardens descended in a series of terraces. The Italian garden featured a reflecting pool and classical statuary. The walled garden enclosed 3 acres of flowering plants arranged in geometric beds. The shrub garden collected specimens from across the world in a naturalistic setting. The ramble offered walking paths through carefully planned woodland scenery. Beyond the formal gardens, Olmsted created what he called a managed forest. He hired Gifford Pinchot, who would later become the first chief of the United States Forest Service, to implement scientific forestry practices on thousands of acres. The goal was to prove that American forests could be harvested sustainably while remaining profitable. The Biltmore Forestry Program became a model for conservation efforts nationwide and trained a generation of professional foresters. The farm operations occupied thousands of additional acres. A dairy herd produced milk, butter, and cheese. Vegetable gardens supplied the house kitchen. Livestock provided meat. Orchards yielded fruit. The estate was designed to be self-sufficient, producing everything needed for daily operations, while also generating income from surplus production sold to the local market. The financial reality was less sustainable than George hoped. Annual operating costs for the house and grounds exceeded $250,000, equivalent to millions in current dollars. George's income from his inheritance and trust funds was substantial, but not unlimited. The estate consumed wealth faster than his investments generated it. Within a few years of completion, George began seeking ways to reduce expenses. He married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in 1898, 3 years after opening the house. Their daughter Cornelia was born in 1900, the only child George would have. The house that could accommodate dozens of guests and required a staff of 80 was occupied by a family of 3. George tried various schemes to make the estate financially viable. He opened a commercial dairy to sell Biltmore products to a wider market. He sold timber from the managed forests. He experimented with different agricultural approaches on the farmland. None generated sufficient revenue to offset the crushing operating costs. The house itself was simply too large and too expensive to maintain, even for a Vanderbilt. The problem was structural, not personal. Biltmore represented the absolute peak of what private wealth could build in America at the end of the 19th century. But the economic conditions that made such construction possible were already changing. George had built his château during a brief window when vast inherited fortunes faced almost no taxation. Labor was cheap and abundant, and society accepted extreme displays of wealth as natural consequences of industrial success. That window was closing. The Panic of 1893 had shaken public confidence in unregulated capitalism. Labor unions were organizing against the industrialists whose fortunes funded estates like Biltmore. Progressive politicians were beginning to question whether such concentrated wealth served any public good. The pressure was building toward systematic change. George died unexpectedly in 1914 at age 51 following complications from an appendectomy. His widow Edith inherited the estate and immediately confronted the financial crisis that George had been delaying. The house was consuming her resources. Property taxes were increasing as local governments sought revenue. The national mood was turning against ostentatious displays of inherited wealth. Edith made a decision that would save Biltmore but transform it completely. In 1930, she opened the house and gardens to paying tourists. Admission fees would help cover operating costs. The private residence became a public attraction. The family continued living in a small section of the house, but most rooms were now displayed for visitors who paid to see how the ultra-wealthy had lived a generation earlier. The transformation revealed something fundamental about Gilded Age mansions. They could not survive as residences. The economic model that built them had collapsed. The only way to preserve them was to convert them into museums. monuments to an era that had ended almost as soon as it began. Other Vanderbilt properties faced similar choices. The breakers in Newport, Marble House, and dozens of other family estates would eventually open to the public or be demolished. The generation that built these houses intended them as dynasty headquarters that would shelter their descendants for centuries. Instead, they became tourist attractions within decades. Biltmore stood at the peak of American mansion building. It was the largest, the most expensive, and the last of its kind. Nothing comparable would ever be built again. Not because Americans lost their ambition or their wealth, but because the rules changed. The forces that would make Biltmore impossible to repeat were already gathering strength in 1895. Within 20 years, they would fundamentally alter how wealthy Americans could live. In 1913, the same year George Vanderbilt died, the United States government fundamentally altered the rules of American wealth. On February 3rd, the states completed ratification of the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. Congress now possessed permanent authority to levy taxes on income from whatever source derived. The era of untaxed fortunes was over. Before 1913, the federal government had imposed an income tax only briefly during the Civil War. That temporary measure expired in 1872. The Supreme Court struck down a subsequent attempt in 1895, ruling that direct taxation without apportionment among the states violated the Constitution. For most of the Gilded Age, wealthy Americans faced no federal income tax whatsoever. They could accumulate and spend their fortunes without government interference, beyond modest tariffs and excise taxes. The 16th Amendment changed everything. Congress passed the first permanent income tax law in October 1913. The initial rates appeared modest. Income below $3,000 faced no tax at all. Income between $3,000 and $20,000 was taxed at 1%. The top marginal rate of 7% applied only to income exceeding $500,000 annually, which affected perhaps a few hundred families nationwide. The rates did not stay modest. World War I demanded unprecedented government revenue. Congress raised the top marginal rate to 15% in 1916, then to 67% in 1917, and finally to 77% in 1918. The threshold for the top rate dropped to $1 million, capturing a larger number of wealthy individuals. A man who earned $2 million in 1918 would surrender more than $1.5 million to federal taxation. The war ended, but the high rates largely remained. Congress reduced the top rate to 73% in 1921, then to 58% in 1922, and finally to 25% in 1925. For a few years, it appeared that taxation might return to something approaching the pre-war norm. Wealthy families resumed building, spending, and displaying their fortunes as they had before. The Great Depression destroyed that hope permanently. The stock market collapsed in October 1929. Banks failed by the thousands. Unemployment reached 25% nationally and exceeded 30% in industrial cities. The American economy contracted by roughly one-third within 4 years. Public fury at the wealthy intensified as breadlines lengthened and shantytowns spread. President Herbert Hoover, himself a wealthy man who had made his fortune in mining, proposed raising taxes on the rich to address the deficit and fund relief programs. Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1932, which increased the top marginal rate to 63%. When Franklin Roosevelt won the presidency in a landslide that November, he made higher taxes on the wealthy a centerpiece of his New Deal agenda. The Revenue Act of 1935 raised the top rate to 79% on income exceeding $5 million annually. Roosevelt called it the wealth tax, and he defended it explicitly as an attack on concentrated fortunes. He argued that extreme inequality threatened democracy itself, and that progressive taxation would redistribute wealth more fairly across society. The Supreme Court upheld the new tax rates, abandoning its earlier hostility to income taxation. By 1940, the top marginal rate had reached 81%. During World War II, It climbed to 94% on income over $200,000. For the next 3 decades, the top rate never dropped below 70%. A wealthy American who earned $1 million annually might keep less than $100,000 after federal taxes. The income tax was only part of the squeeze on mansion economics. Estate taxes struck when wealth transferred between generations. Congress first imposed a federal estate tax in 1916 at a maximum rate of 10% on estates exceeding $5 million. The rate rose steadily, reaching 25% by 1924, 45% by 1934, and 77% by 1941. The combination was devastating for families attempting to maintain large estates across generations. A fortune that survived income taxation while the original builder lived faced estate taxation when he died. If his heir attempted to maintain the family mansion, annual property taxes consumed additional wealth. The three-legged tax system ensured that even the largest fortunes would eventually be dispersed or depleted. Property taxes escalated simultaneously at state and local levels. State governments and municipalities, desperate for revenue during the Depression, raised assessment values and increased mill rates. A mansion that might have faced property taxes of a few $1,000s annually in 1913 could face bills exceeding $50,000 by the 1930s. The ongoing cost of owning a palace became prohibitive regardless of income. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Consider a mansion requiring $250,000 annually to operate, similar to Biltmore's costs. In 1913, a man with $500,000 in annual income faced no federal income tax and could easily cover those expenses. By 1935, that same income faced federal taxes, approaching $400,000. The remaining $100,000 could not maintain the estate, pay property taxes, and support the family. Some attempted to restructure their holdings to minimize taxation. Trusts and foundations offered limited protection. Splitting assets among family members spread the burden. Strategic charitable giving reduced taxable estates, but these measures could only delay the inevitable for properties requiring hundreds of thousands of dollars in annual upkeep. The servants who maintained these houses were also disappearing. The domestic service industry, which had employed millions of Americans before World War I, contracted dramatically during the 1920s and collapsed during the Depression. Industrial jobs paid better than household service. Social attitudes shifted against servitude as a career. Even wealthy families who could afford large staffs found it increasingly difficult to hire qualified workers. Labor laws added pressure. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 established minimum wages and maximum hours for most workers. State laws mandated workers' compensation insurance. Union organizing brought collective bargaining to industries that supplied mansions with goods and services. The cheap, abundant labor that had made Gilded Age estates economically feasible was vanishing. Technology partially compensated. Modern appliances reduced the work required to maintain a large house. Central heating systems replaced coal furnaces that needed constant tending. Electric refrigeration eliminated ice delivery. Vacuum cleaners reduced the staff needed for cleaning. But no technology could eliminate the fundamental problem. A 250-room house remained vastly more expensive to operate than a 20-room house, regardless of mechanical improvements. The wealthy adapted by reducing scale. New construction in the 1920s and 1930s featured far fewer rooms than Gilded Age mansions. Wealthy families built large, comfortable homes, but not palaces. 20 or 30 rooms became the new standard for the very rich. 50 rooms marked exceptional ambition. No one attempted to match Biltmore's 250. Existing mansions became liabilities. Property that had been assets on balance sheets transformed into drains on family resources. The land might be valuable, but the buildings sitting on that land actively destroyed wealth through operating costs and taxation. Families faced a choice: maintain the mansion and watch the fortune disappear, or demolish the house and liquidate the asset. Most chose demolition. The mansion die-off would begin in earnest within a decade, but the economic forces that made it inevitable were already in place by the mid-1930s. Income tax, estate tax, and property tax had created an environment where building or maintaining a mega mansion was financially suicidal. The government had not made such houses illegal. It had simply made them impossible to sustain. The tax code had solved a political problem, extreme wealth inequality, which had threatened social stability during the Gilded Age, was being systematically reduced through progressive taxation. Fortunes could still be built, but they could not be preserved intact across generations while maintaining ostentatious displays of consumption. Society had decided through its elected representatives that concentration of wealth at Vanderbilt levels was unacceptable. The question that remained was practical rather than political. The billionaires who survived this transformation did not become poor. They remained extraordinarily wealthy by any measure. They simply could no longer afford to live in 250-room houses. What would they do instead? The answer would reshape American elite culture entirely. The demolition began on Fifth Avenue. In 1926, the mansion that Cornelius Vanderbilt II had built at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 57th Street came down. Completed in 1883, the house had occupied an entire city block. It featured 130 rooms, a ballroom that could accommodate 200 guests, and interiors designed by the finest craftsmen in America. The family had lived there for 43 years. Demolition took less than 6 months. The site became commercial property. A bank and office building replaced the mansion, generating rental income that dwarfed what the residents had cost to maintain. The Vanderbilts had made the economically rational choice. The house was consuming wealth. The land beneath it was valuable. Demolition solved both problems simultaneously. The pattern repeated across Manhattan. William Kissam Vanderbilt's mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue, completed in 1883 at a cost equivalent to tens of millions in current dollars, was demolished in 1927. The house had been the first in New York designed in the French château style, setting a trend that dominated elite architecture for a generation. 44 years after construction, it became rubble. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor's mansion at Fifth Avenue and 65th Street disappeared in 1926. Mrs. Astor had been the queen of New York society, and her annual ball defined who belonged to the city's elite. Her ballroom could hold exactly 400 guests, giving rise to the phrase, the 400, as shorthand for high society. The mansion that hosted this social power was razed to make room for a luxury apartment building. The statistics tell the story. In 1900, more than 100 major Gilded Age mansions lined Fifth Avenue between 42nd Street and 96th Street. These were not simply large houses. They were palaces, each requiring staffs of 20 to 50 servants, each representing millions of dollars in construction costs and hundreds of thousands in annual upkeep. By 1950, fewer than 10 survived. The rest had been demolished and replaced with apartment buildings, hotels, and commercial structures. The wave of destruction spread beyond Manhattan. Newport, Rhode Island, had been the summer capital of Gilded Age society. Families built cottages along the Atlantic coast that rivaled European palaces in scale and cost. These were vacation homes, occupied for perhaps 8 weeks each summer, staffed year-round to maintain them in readiness. The breakers, built by Cornelius Vanderbilt II in 1895 at a cost of $7 million, survived only because the family donated it to the Preservation Society of Newport County in 1948. The alternative was demolition. No family member could afford to maintain a 70-room summer house that required 40 servants to operate. Donating it as a museum provided a tax deduction while ensuring its preservation. The house opened to tourists in 1948, and admission fees now fund its maintenance. Marble House, built by William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1892, followed the same path. The family gave it to the Preservation Society in 1963. Rosecliff, Château-sur-Mer, and other Newport mansions survived through similar arrangements. The houses that could not attract donors or preservation societies disappeared. Chicago lost virtually its entire collection of Gilded Age mansions. Potter Palmer's Castle on Lakeshore Drive, completed in 1885, was demolished in 1950. The house had contained 42 rooms and a 3-story art gallery. Palmer had been one of Chicago's wealthiest merchants, and his mansion had defined elite architecture in the city for decades. The land was worth more empty than occupied. The same pattern played out in San Francisco, Philadelphia, Cleveland, and every major American city. Houses built to last centuries were demolished within 2 or 3 generations. The economics were inescapable. Annual operating costs exceeded what even wealthy families could justify spending. Property taxes consumed additional resources. The land itself was worth more for higher density uses. What replaced these mansions reveals the transformation clearly. Apartment buildings generated rental income from dozens or hundreds of units on the same land that had held one family. Office buildings created even higher returns. Commercial hotels put property to profit-generating use. The American real estate market had become too sophisticated and too expensive to tolerate single-family mansions on premium urban land. The few mansions that survived did so by transforming their function entirely. The Frick Collection in Manhattan occupies the former residence of industrialist Henry Clay Frick. Completed in 1914, the house was designed from the beginning with eventual museum use in mind. Frick's will provided an endowment to maintain it as a public art gallery after his death. The house opened as a museum in 1935 and remains one of New York's premier cultural institutions. The Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum occupies Andrew Carnegie's mansion at 5th Avenue and 91st Street. Built in 1902, the 64-room house was the northernmost mansion on 5th Avenue when constructed. Carnegie chose the location specifically because land was cheaper than further downtown. The family donated it to the Smithsonian in 1972 for conversion to a museum. It was preserved because it became something other than a residence. The Morgan Library preserves J.P. Morgan's library building adjacent to his demolished mansion. Morgan built the library in 1906 to house his collection of rare books and manuscripts. The house is gone, but the library survives as a museum and research center. The pattern holds. Institutional use justified preservation. Residential use guaranteed demolition. Even Biltmore, the largest and most famous of all American mansions, survived only by opening to tourists in 1930. The Vanderbilt family retained ownership but could no longer afford to live in the entire house. Admission fees from visitors covered operating costs that no family could sustain. Privately, the house became a museum that happened to have family members still living in one wing. The staff crisis accelerated the demolition wave. Domestic service had employed millions of Americans before World War I. By the 1930s, the industry had collapsed. Young people chose factory jobs or clerical work over household service. Even families with sufficient wealth to maintain large houses could not find workers willing to fill the positions. Technology helped, but could not compensate entirely. Modern appliances reduced the work required for cleaning, cooking, and maintenance. Central systems for heating and cooling eliminated some of the most labor-intensive tasks. But no technological advance could make a 100-room house as efficient to operate as a 20-room house. The scale itself was the problem. The Great Depression provided the final push. Families struggling to maintain enormous houses while their investment income disappeared faced stark choices. Some held on through the 1930s, consuming capital to cover operating losses. Most concluded that preserving the family fortune mattered more than preserving the family mansion. The houses came down. By 1950, the transformation was complete. The American mansion as Gilded Age symbol had become extinct. Those that survived did so as museums, schools, or institutional buildings. None functioned as private residences in the way their builders had intended. The era of building palaces for oneself had ended permanently. The wealthy did not disappear. They simply learned to live differently. The billionaires who remained after the mansion die-off controlled fortunes that would have astonished the Vanderbilts. They had adapted to a world where visible displays of wealth invited taxation, regulation, and public fury. The question was not whether they would continue spending lavishly. The question was where their money would go if not into 250-room houses. The modern billionaire owns more than George Vanderbilt ever imagined. You just cannot see it. Bill Gates lives in a house called Xanadu 2.0 on the shore of Lake Washington near Seattle. The residence measures approximately 66,000 square feet, spread across multiple buildings on 5 acres. This is large by any standard. It would accommodate perhaps 40 rooms if divided conventionally. But it is not a palace. It is not meant to be seen from the street or to inspire awe in visitors. The approach is deliberately understated. Trees screen the property from public view. The design prioritizes technology and privacy over grandeur and display. The house cost an estimated $63 million to build in the 1990s, a substantial sum but a fraction of what Gates could afford. His net worth has exceeded $100 billion at various points. He could have built 10 Biltmores. He chose not to. The decision was strategic, not modest. Jeff Bezos follows a similar pattern. His real estate holdings span multiple properties worth hundreds of millions collectively. A mansion in Beverly Hills, apartments in New York, a ranch in Texas, a compound in Washington. Each property is substantial, but none approaches palace scale. Bezos owns more total residential square footage than the Vanderbilts did, but he has distributed it across locations and hidden it behind corporate structures. The public rarely sees any of it. Mark Zuckerberg bought his Palo Alto home in 2011 for $7 million. The house itself is relatively modest for a billionaire, approximately 5,000 square feet. But Zuckerberg then purchased the 4 surrounding properties over the following years for a combined $43 million. The strategy was not expansion, but privacy. By controlling the neighboring land, he created a buffer zone that prevents close observation of his residence. The investment was defensive, not ostentatious. This pattern reflects a deliberate shift in how the ultra-wealthy approach residential real estate. The calculation has changed completely since the Gilded Age. Building a visible palace creates multiple problems that Gates, Bezos, and Zuckerberg understand instinctively. First, security. Ostentatious display attracts unwanted attention. Kidnapping became a serious concern for wealthy families after the Lindbergh baby abduction in 1932. Subsequent decades brought additional threats from political radicals, opportunistic criminals, and mentally unstable individuals fixated on the rich. A visible mansion advertises the location of vulnerable family members. Modern billionaires prefer anonymity. Second, taxation. Property assessors notice palaces. A 250-room mansion generates an enormous property tax bill annually. Assessment fights with local governments consume time and money. Smaller properties in favorable jurisdictions minimize this burden. Many billionaires maintain legal residences in states with no income tax and low property taxes. Florida, Texas, Nevada, and Wyoming attract wealthy residents for precisely this reason. Third, public relations. Building a palace invites media coverage and public criticism. The Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011 demonstrated continuing public hostility toward visible wealth inequality. Politicians seeking populist support target billionaire excess regularly. Conspicuous consumption creates political liabilities that billionaires prefer to avoid. The strategic response has been to shift wealth away from residential real estate entirely. Rather than investing hundreds of millions in a single showpiece mansion, modern billionaires deploy capital across diverse holdings that generate returns rather than consuming resources. The compound strategy exemplifies this approach. Rather than building one enormous house, wealthy individuals construct multiple smaller structures on large properties. Each building serves a specific function. One contains living quarters, another houses offices, a third provides guest accommodations, a fourth holds recreational facilities. The total square footage may equal or exceed Gilded Age mansions, but the architectural presentation remains deliberately modest. Silicon Valley billionaires particularly favor this approach. Larry Ellison, founder of Oracle, owns approximately 1,500 acres on the Hawaiian island of Lanai, which he purchased outright for $300 million in 2012. He controls an entire island, something no Vanderbilt achieved. But the individual structures on the property remain relatively small and widely distributed. The power lies in owning the island, not in building a palace visible from the sea. Ownership structure matters as much as physical structure. Modern billionaires typically hold property through limited liability companies, trusts, and other legal entities that obscure personal connection. Public records may show that 123 Property Holdings LLC owns a particular estate, but connecting that entity to a specific billionaire requires substantial research. The privacy protection is deliberate and professionally maintained. This opacity serves multiple purposes. It complicates security threats by making it harder to locate family members. It reduces property tax assessments by eliminating the premium that attaches to celebrity ownership. It shields wealth from public scrutiny that might generate political pressure for higher taxation. The strategy treats residential real estate as a security liability to be minimized rather than a status symbol to be displayed. The tax advantages extend beyond annual property taxes. Estate planning drives many residential real estate decisions. A $100 million mansion represents $100 million subject to estate tax when the owner dies. That same $100 million invested in productive assets generates income while growing in value, and sophisticated estate planning can shield much of it from taxation. The mansion consumes wealth. The investment portfolio multiplies it. Conservation easements provide additional benefits. Wealthy landowners who donate development rights on large properties receive substantial tax deductions while retaining use of the land. Ted Turner has used this strategy extensively on his numerous ranches across the American West. The land remains in his control, but he captures tax benefits by restricting future development. The calculation is straightforward. A billionaire with $10 billion in assets who builds a $500 million palace destroys wealth in multiple ways. Construction consumes capital. Annual operating costs consume additional capital. Property taxes consume more. The asset appreciates slowly, if at all, while requiring constant maintenance. When the owner dies, estate taxes claim a significant portion. The palace is a wealth destruction machine. That same $500 million invested in a diversified portfolio of stocks, bonds, and private equity generates substantial annual returns. The assets grow over time. Professional management minimizes tax liability. Estate planning structures protect the wealth for future generations. The portfolio is a wealth multiplication machine. Modern billionaires understand this calculation perfectly. They maintain comfortable residences, often quite large by normal standards, but they avoid the scale that defined Gilded Age mansions. The wealth exists, but it flows into channels that generate returns rather than consuming resources. The question is where that wealth goes, if not into palaces. The answer reveals something more troubling than Gilded Age ostentation. John D. Rockefeller built Kykuit, his estate overlooking the Hudson River. His foundation built the headquarters of the United Nations. The mansion cost millions. The foundation controls billions. Which represents more power? The Rockefeller model established the pattern that modern billionaires follow. Transform from hated monopolist to celebrated philanthropist through strategic charitable giving. The strategy serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It provides enormous tax deductions. It shapes public policy without democratic oversight. It purchases reputation and legacy. Most importantly, it allows wealth to exercise power across generations in ways that mansions never could. The modern charitable foundation operates as something between a nonprofit organization and a dynastic trust. Assets placed in the foundation avoid estate taxation entirely. The foundation itself pays no taxes on investment income. Grants to qualified charities provide public benefit while advancing the founder's priorities. Family members often serve as trustees, controlling billions in perpetuity. The scale dwarfs anything the Gilded Age imagined. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation holds an endowment exceeding $50 billion, making it the largest private charitable foundation in the world. Annual grant-making exceeds $5 billion. The foundation shapes global health policy, education reform, and agricultural development across dozens of countries. Its influence on international vaccination programs alone affects hundreds of millions of people. The foundation model provides something a mansion cannot. A palace displays wealth but exercises no direct power beyond impressing visitors. A foundation with a $50 billion endowment shapes the priorities of governments, universities, and international organizations. Gates Foundation funding decisions influence research agendas, public health strategies, and educational policies worldwide. This is power that persists regardless of where Bill Gates chooses to sleep at night. The Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, established in 2015, takes the model further. Rather than creating a traditional charitable foundation, Mark Zuckerberg and his wife Priscilla Chan structured their philanthropy as a limited liability company. This provides even greater flexibility. An LLC can make political donations, invest in for-profit companies, and lobby for policy changes that traditional foundations cannot pursue. Zuckerberg pledged to transfer 99% of his Facebook shares to the initiative, a commitment worth more than $100 billion at various market valuations. The LLC structure attracted criticism precisely because it avoids the restrictions that apply to charitable foundations. Traditional foundations must distribute at least 5% of their assets annually to qualified charities. They face strict limits on political activity. They must disclose their finances publicly. The Chan Zuckerberg Initiative faces none of these requirements. It operates as a private investment vehicle that can pursue any goal the founders choose, charitable or otherwise, while benefiting from the tax deductions associated with charitable giving. Jeff Bezos announced the Bezos Earth Fund in 2020, committing $10 billion to fight climate change. The sum represents approximately 8% of his net worth at the time, a substantial commitment but hardly a sacrifice. The fund provides Bezos with significant influence over climate policy and environmental organizations worldwide. More importantly, it provides favorable publicity at a time when Amazon faces increasing criticism for its environmental impact and labor practices. The tax implications are substantial. A billionaire who donates $10 billion to a charitable foundation receives a tax deduction for the full amount. At the highest tax rates, this could save approximately $4 billion in federal taxes. The remaining $6 billion, which the billionaire genuinely surrendered, purchases enormous influence over how and where those funds are deployed. The foundation invests the endowment, generating returns that fund grants in perpetuity. The donor's priorities shape charitable giving long after their death. Media ownership provides another channel for influence that mansions could never deliver. Jeff Bezos purchased The Washington Post in 2013 for $250 million. This was pocket change for a man worth more than $100 billion at the time. But the acquisition provided ownership of one of America's most influential newspapers, a publication that shapes political discourse in the nation's capital. The Post operates independently under Bezos's ownership, maintaining journalistic standards that predate his acquisition. But the mere fact of his ownership raises inevitable questions about coverage of Amazon, his space company Blue Origin, and his personal affairs. Publishers traditionally wielded enormous political influence. Bezos acquired that influence for less than the cost of maintaining Biltmore for 2 years. Laurene Powell Jobs, widow of Apple founder Steve Jobs, purchased a majority stake in The Atlantic magazine in 2017. Mark Benioff, founder of Salesforce, bought Time magazine in 2018 for $190 million. Patrick Soon-Shiong purchased the Los Angeles Times in 2018 for $500 million. In each case, billionaires acquired major media properties for sums that represented tiny fractions of their total wealth. The pattern reflects a calculated strategy. Major media properties confer prestige and influence disproportionate to their financial value. Most operate at losses or narrow margins, making them unattractive to profit-focused investors. But for billionaires seeking platforms to shape public discourse, these properties are bargains. The cost of ownership is trivial. The potential influence is substantial. Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter in 2022 for approximately $44 billion represents the extreme version of this strategy. The platform had roughly 400 million users and served as a primary channel for political discourse, news dissemination, and public debate. Musk's purchase gave him control over the algorithms that determine what hundreds of millions of people see, the moderation policies that govern what they can say, and the features that shape how they interact. The price was substantial even for Musk, requiring him to leverage other assets and take on significant debt. But the acquisition provided something no mansion could offer. Twitter is infrastructure. It is a platform that politicians, journalists, activists, and citizens worldwide depend on for communication. Controlling that platform provides influence over public discourse itself. The comparison to Gilded Age power is instructive. John D. Rockefeller controlled 90% of American oil refining. This gave him enormous economic power and substantial political influence. But his power operated through market mechanisms and was ultimately constrained by antitrust law. Modern platform owners exercise power more directly. They control the systems through which information flows, conversations occur, and communities form. Mark Zuckerberg controls Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, platforms with more than 3 billion combined users. This is a larger population than any nation-state. The algorithms that determine what content these users see, the policies that govern what they can post, and the data collection practices that monetize their attention are all controlled by Zuckerberg and his subordinates. No king, president, or prime minister exercises comparable power over so many people. Jeff Bezos built Amazon into a platform that controls approximately 40% of American e-commerce. Amazon Web Services provides the infrastructure that runs substantial portions of the internet. Bezos also owns the Washington Post and is building Blue Origin to commercialize space access. The integration of e-commerce platform, cloud computing infrastructure, media property, and aerospace company creates a vertically integrated empire that Standard Oil might envy. The political influence flows naturally from economic control. The largest corporations spend hundreds of millions annually on lobbying and campaign contributions. The Supreme Court's Citizens United decision in 2010 removed many restrictions on corporate political spending, opening channels for wealth to influence elections directly. Billionaires can now fund political campaigns, lobbying efforts, and issue advocacy at scales that would have been illegal in previous generations. The calculation is straightforward. Why build a palace that costs hundreds of millions, generates no income, and exercises no power beyond aesthetic display when that same capital could fund a foundation that shapes global health policy, purchase a media property that influences public discourse, or acquire a platform that controls how billions of people communicate? The answer is obvious to every modern billionaire. The mansion is obsolete. Not because wealth disappeared, but because better instruments of power emerged. The Vanderbilts built monuments to themselves that tourists now visit for admission fees. Modern billionaires build systems of control that most people do not even recognize as concentrated power. The wealth is greater. The influence is deeper. The visibility is far less. Yet for all this influence, the ultra-wealthy still need somewhere to live. What they build now reveals the final transformation of American elite culture. Mark Zuckerberg's compound on the Hawaiian island of Kauai illustrates the modern approach. Beginning in 2014, Zuckerberg and his wife purchased approximately 100 acres of land on the island's north shore for more than $100 million. The property includes beaches, forests, and former plantation land. In 2016, Zuckerberg began constructing a 6-foot wall around portions of the property, triggering local controversy and accusations of colonialism. The wall was not decorative, it was functional, designed to prevent observation and access. The compound strategy reflects the fortress mentality that defines modern billionaire residential planning. Rather than building a palace that welcomes admiration, Zuckerberg constructed a barrier that enforces exclusion. The contrast with Biltmore could not be more complete. George Vanderbilt built his mansion on a prominent hilltop and invited visitors to marvel at its scale. Zuckerberg hides behind walls on a remote island and resents anyone who notices. Larry Ellison took the fortress concept to its logical extreme. In 2012, Ellison purchased approximately 98% of the Hawaiian island of Lanai for an estimated $300 million. The island spans roughly 140 square miles and had a population of about 3,000 residents at the time of purchase. Ellison now controls nearly an entire island, something no American tycoon had achieved since the 19th century. Ellison has not built a single mega mansion on Lanai. Instead, he has developed multiple properties across the island, invested in luxury resorts, and implemented agricultural and conservation projects. The strategy treats the island itself as the estate rather than any individual structure. Geographic isolation provides security and privacy that walls alone cannot deliver. Owning the island means controlling who arrives and under what circumstances. The ranch estate represents another favored approach among the ultra-wealthy. Ted Turner owns approximately 2 million acres across multiple properties in Montana, Nebraska, New Mexico, and other western states. This makes him the second largest private landowner in America. John Malone owns approximately 2.2 million acres, making him the largest. Both men acquired their holdings gradually over decades, assembling enormous territories from smaller ranches and farms. These properties are not residential showpieces. They are working ranches that generate modest income from cattle, bison, and conservation activities. The residences on these properties remain relatively modest, often comprising multiple small structures rather than single palaces. The power lies in controlling vast territories, not in building impressive houses. A billionaire who owns 1 million acres controls more land than many European principalities, but does so without attracting the attention that a 250-room mansion would generate. The conservation framing provides additional benefits. Wealthy landowners who place conservation easements on their properties receive substantial tax deductions while retaining use of the land. The easements restrict future development, protecting the land in perpetuity while providing immediate financial benefits to the owner. Turner has used this strategy extensively, protecting hundreds of thousands of acres while capturing tax benefits worth tens of millions. The Doomsday bunker trend reveals something darker about modern billionaire psychology. Since 2008, survivalist preparation has become increasingly common among Silicon Valley elites. Peter Thiel purchased property in New Zealand and obtained citizenship there, reportedly as insurance against social collapse in the United States. Other tech billionaires have followed similar strategies, acquiring remote properties as potential refugees. The bunker construction industry has grown to serve this demand. Companies now specialize in converting decommissioned missile silos into luxury underground residences. These facilities feature air filtration systems, independent power generation, extensive food storage, and security systems designed to withstand civil unrest or environmental catastrophe. Prices range from hundreds of thousands to tens of millions of dollars, depending on specifications. The psychology behind bunker preparation differs fundamentally from Gilded Age mansion building. Vanderbilt built Biltmore to display confidence and permanence. He expected his fortune and his family to endure for generations on that mountain. Modern billionaires building bunkers expect society to collapse and plan accordingly. The shift from palace to fortress to bunker traces a progression from confidence to anxiety to paranoia. Urban anonymity provides yet another strategy. Ken Griffin, founder of hedge fund Citadel, has purchased multiple floors in Chicago's highest residential buildings rather than building a single mansion. The strategy provides luxury accommodation while avoiding the visibility of a standalone palace. High-rise living offers security advantages through controlled access, professional management, and the anonymity that comes from living among other wealthy residents rather than in an isolated estate. Griffin announced in 2021 that he would relocate Citadel's headquarters from Chicago to Miami, citing concerns about crime and Chicago's tax environment. Florida offers no state income tax, lower property taxes, and a political climate favorable to business interests. The move illustrates how modern billionaires prioritize tax efficiency over any particular location or architectural legacy. The corporate campus residence represents perhaps the most distinctive modern development. Major technology companies now provide housing for employees on or near company property, blurring the boundary between work and life. Google, Facebook, and Apple have all developed extensive campuses that include not just offices, but also restaurants, fitness facilities, medical services, and in some cases residential units. For billionaire founders and executives, the campus becomes a kind of estate. Larry Page and Sergey Brin effectively live at Google, spending more waking hours on campus than anywhere else. Mark Zuckerberg's home in Palo Alto sits minutes from Facebook headquarters, and he reportedly works from home regularly, making the distinction between residence and office largely semantic. The campus provides everything a traditional estate offered: security, services, community, without the visibility and tax burden of a palace. Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin facility in West Texas illustrates this model at its most extreme. The company's launch site and testing facility sprawls across hundreds of thousands of acres in a remote desert region. Bezos maintains residential facilities on the property, blending workspace with personal retreat. The facility is technically a commercial aerospace operation, but it also functions as a private domain where Bezos can pursue his space ambitions away from public scrutiny. Common threads connect these diverse strategies. Every approach prioritizes privacy and security over display. Every approach seeks to minimize taxation through jurisdiction selection, legal structures, or conservation mechanisms. Every approach reflects awareness that visible wealth attracts negative attention from criminals, activists, politicians, and the public. Most importantly, none of these approaches creates anything like Biltmore. No modern billionaire builds a 250-room house meant to be admired by the public and preserved for generations. The ultra-wealthy still control enormous resources and occupy substantial properties, but they do so in ways designed to hide wealth rather than display it. The mansion as statement of permanence and confidence has been replaced by compounds, ranches, bunkers, and urban anonymity that reflect a different psychology entirely. The question is whether this transformation represents progress. Gilded Age mansions offended democratic sensibilities and wasted resources on ostentation. But at least everyone could see the wealth and knew who possessed it. Modern billionaire holdings are vast, powerful, and largely invisible. The public cannot photograph what it cannot find. The tax assessor cannot value what is hidden behind LLCs. The historian cannot study what leaves no architectural record. Biltmore still stands because it became something George Vanderbilt never intended. The private retreat became a public museum. The family seat became a tourist attraction. The monument to one man's wealth became a source of employment and economic activity for an entire region. Whether any of today's billionaire compounds will serve similar purposes a century from now remains uncertain. Most were designed to disappear rather than endure. Block, Section 7, She Word. Count, approx. 1,050 words. Today, Biltmore Estate receives approximately 1.4 million visitors annually. They arrive by car and tour bus, purchase admission tickets, and walk through rooms preserved exactly as they appeared when George Vanderbilt died. The banquet hall still displays the long table set for Christmas dinner. The library still holds thousands of books on shelves rising 2 stories high. The winter garden still features tropical plants beneath glass skylights. The house has become what it could never be while the family lived there fully, a monument to a vanished world. The estate operates as a profitable business. Admission fees generate more than $100 million in annual revenue. The property includes hotels, restaurants, a winery, and retail operations. Employment exceeds 2,000 people, making Biltmore one of the largest employers in western North Carolina. The house that consumed George Vanderbilt's fortune now generates substantial income for his descendants and provides economic benefits to the surrounding region. The financial model represents the only viable path for preserving Gilded Age mansions. Private residential use proved economically impossible. Only by transforming into tourist attractions, museums, or institutional facilities could these structures survive. Biltmore succeeded where most others failed because the family adapted early, opening to tourists in 1930 when commercial tourism was still developing as an industry. The experience of visiting Biltmore today reveals what has been preserved and what has been lost. Tourists wander through rooms that once accommodated only family, guests, and servants. They photograph spaces where the Vanderbilts lived their private lives. They examine furnishings and art collections that were never meant for public display. The house has been democratized through admission fees, allowing anyone with $75 to experience rooms that George Vanderbilt built for his exclusive use. What visitors see is genuinely remarkable. The craftsmanship that built Biltmore cannot be replicated today. The stone carving, the woodwork, the ceiling details, the technological systems all represent skills and techniques that have largely disappeared from American construction. Modern building codes, labor costs, and architectural priorities make such work prohibitively expensive even for billionaires who could theoretically afford it. The scale itself astonishes. Walking through Biltmore requires hours. The distances between rooms, the heights of ceilings, the dimensions of public spaces all exceed what modern residential architecture attempts. Contemporary luxury homes may feature expensive materials and elaborate technology, but they rarely achieve the monumental scale that defined Gilded Age construction. Size for its own sake no longer serves any practical or social purpose. The preservation success comes with costs. Biltmore is frozen in 1895, maintained as a historical exhibit rather than an evolving residence. The family, Members who still live on the property occupy a small section and remain invisible to tourists. The house has become a museum that happens to have descendants living in it, rather than a family home that welcomes visitors. The transformation ensured survival, but eliminated the original purpose. The comparison to demolished mansions reinforces how fortunate Biltmore's preservation was. Of the hundreds of comparable houses built during the Gilded Age, fewer than a dozen survive in anything approaching original condition. The Vanderbilt mansions on Fifth Avenue are gone. The Palmer Mansion in Chicago is gone. Dozens of Newport cottages are gone. San Francisco lost virtually everything in the 1906 earthquake and subsequent development. Most American cities retain perhaps one or two examples of Gilded Age domestic architecture, usually preserved through donation to museums or conversion to institutional use. What was lost architecturally represents more than just buildings. An entire approach to construction disappeared. The Gilded Age produced craftsmen who specialized in stone carving, decorative plasterwork, hand-forged metalwork, and other skills that required years of apprenticeship to master. These trades sustained communities of artisans who passed techniques across generations. When mansion construction ended, these skills largely vanished. Modern construction employs different methods, different materials, and different labor structures. The knowledge of how to build a Biltmore has been substantially lost. The cultural loss is harder to quantify. Gilded Age mansions represented a particular approach to wealth, one that valued permanent physical monuments over financial instruments. Vanderbilt built Biltmore to stand for centuries, to house generations of descendants, to serve as a visible testament to family achievement. He invested enormous resources in something that generated no financial return, but created aesthetic and cultural value that tourists still appreciate more than a century later. Modern billionaires make different choices. Their wealth flows into foundations, media properties, technology platforms, and investment portfolios that generate returns and exercise power. These instruments are more financially rational than mansions. They preserve and grow wealth rather than consuming it. They influence policy and shape society in ways that buildings cannot. But they create nothing that will draw tourists a century from now. The tax system that destroyed mansion economics funded genuine public goods. The revenue from progressive taxation built highways, schools, hospitals, and social programs that benefited millions of Americans. The Gilded Age concentrated wealth in the hands of a tiny elite while leaving the majority of the population with limited access to education, healthcare, or economic opportunity. The tax reforms of the early 20th century redistributed resources in ways that created broader prosperity and social stability. Yet something was lost in the trade. The visible inequality of Gilded Age America was offensive, but it was visible. Everyone could see the mansions, identify their owners, and organize politically to challenge concentrated wealth. Ida Tarbell investigated Standard Oil because the company was large enough to be noticed. Labor unions organized against industrialists whose palaces demonstrated their wealth. Progressive politicians mobilized public anger at ostentatious displays of excess. Modern inequality is worse by most measures. The wealth gap between the richest Americans and the median household exceeds Gilded Age levels, but the inequality is less visible. Billionaires hide behind LLCs, foundations, and geographically dispersed holdings. They exercise power through platforms and media properties that most people do not recognize as instruments of concentrated wealth. The system is harder to challenge because it is harder to see. The case for visible wealth is not aesthetic or moral. It is practical. When inequality is visible, democratic societies can respond to it. Voters can demand taxation. Legislators can regulate monopolies. Journalists can investigate abuses. The system remains accountable. Because the evidence of concentrated power cannot be hidden. When inequality becomes invisible, accountability becomes more difficult. How does one investigate a foundation's influence over public health policy? How does one regulate a platform's control of information flow? How does one tax wealth that is distributed across hundreds of legal entities and dozens of jurisdictions? The modern ultra-wealthy have learned to exercise power without creating monuments that document that power. They have solved the problem that destroyed Gilded Age mansions by making their wealth and influence harder to perceive. The central question remains unresolved. Is modern invisibility better than Gilded Age ostentation? The answer depends on what aspects of wealth concentration concern you most. If the concern is wastefulness, modern efficiency is clearly superior. Billionaires who invest in productive assets rather than building 250-room houses allocate capital more rationally. Society benefits from investments in technology, research, and business development more than from additional palaces. If the concern is inequality itself, the comparison is less favorable. Wealth concentration has increased, not decreased. The ultra-wealthy control a larger share of total assets than they did in the Gilded Age. The tax system that destroyed mansions has been progressively weakened through lobbying and political influence. Top marginal rates have fallen from 94% to 37%. Estate taxes have been reduced substantially. The system that forced Biltmore to become a museum is weaker than at any point since the 1920s. If the concern is accountability, modern invisibility creates serious problems. Power that operates through foundations, platforms, and media. Properties is harder to challenge than power that built visible palaces. The ultra-wealthy shape education policy, health policy, environmental policy, and media discourse without the public oversight that democratic systems require. Foundations operate in perpetuity with minimal transparency. Platforms control information flow with limited regulation. The concentration of power has increased even as the visibility of that power has decreased. Biltmore stands as evidence of both what was lost and what was gained. The house is beautiful, impractical, wasteful, impressive, offensive, and culturally valuable simultaneously. It represents an era when the wealthy built monuments to themselves that tourists now pay to see. It demonstrates craftsmanship that modern construction rarely attempts. It proves that concentrated wealth, however objectionable, can create things of lasting aesthetic value. But Biltmore also demonstrates that such monuments cannot be sustained. George Vanderbilt built his château to last centuries. It survives not because his descendants maintained it as a private residence, but because they transformed it into a commercial enterprise. The house endures by becoming something its builder never intended. The lesson applies beyond architecture. The billionaires stopped building Biltmores because the world forced them to evolve. Whether they evolved into something better or merely something less visible remains an open question. Modern wealth is more rationally deployed, more strategically protected, and more politically influential than Gilded Age fortunes. It is also less accountable, less visible, and harder to challenge through democratic processes. Standing on Biltmore's terrace, looking across the Blue Ridge Mountains that George Vanderbilt surveyed more than a century ago, visitors see a landscape that appears timeless. The forests have grown. The approach road winds through trees that were planted generations ago. The view stretches for miles in every direction, just as it did when Vanderbilt chose this hilltop for his mansion. The house still stands because it transformed. The fortune that built it dispersed because it could not be protected. The world that made such construction possible ended definitively within 2 decades of Biltmore's completion. Nothing comparable will be built again, not because Americans lack ambition or wealth, but because the incentives have changed completely. Whether future generations will visit museums dedicated to charitable foundations, tour the preserved headquarters of defunct platforms, or examine the archives of 21st century media empires remains uncertain. These institutions may exercise more power than Biltmore ever did, but they will leave fewer monuments for tourists to photograph.